Every sound in the penthouse echoed like a gunshot against Kaido's already frayed nerves, as he pressed his back against the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seoul skyline stretching beyond him like a cruel reminder of the life he barely survived outside these walls. The faint hum of the city below was a stark contrast to the storm inside him. The bruises along his ribs a mosaic of pain and terror. Dark purples and angry reds blooming under the pale skin, he tried desperately to hide with layers of concealer and the crisp lines of his tailored shirt. His fingers trembled as he reached for his tablet, the quarterly projections for Ichigo Group glowing with soft white light, and yet the numbers meant nothing. Profit margins and investor returns were irrelevant when every nerve screamed in anticipation of the inevitable presence that carried a weight no spreadsheet could quantify. The faint scent of cedar and leather tickled his senses from across the room, triggering the automatic curl of his spine, the ingrained reaction of submission he had cultivated to survive the abuse that had once been his daily reality. Haru's voice finally broke the oppressive silence, low and commanding, the kind that threaded through Kaido's defenses without effort. Kaido. The single word made his stomach knot, and he forced himself to meet the dark eyes of the man who had silently dominated the executive suite with an unyielding presence, a predator whose precision was as lethal as the rumors whispered in the corridors, yet whose control was strangely reassuring. "You look like hell," Haru continued, and Kaido felt a jolt of shame and fear, all the carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. "I'm fine," he whispered, the lie tasting metallic in his mouth, mingling with the faint copper tang of blood from a split lip he had pressed closed moments ago, swallowing both scream and sob with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to vanish into the margins of a room. The Alpha stepped closer, and the air around him thickened, a blend of cologne, smoke, and something darker, something innately commanding that Kaido recognized instantly as dominance, not the kind that forced obedience, but the kind that demanded truth from the deepest recesses of his being. Haru's hands hovered, steady and deliberate, as if weighing the fragility of Kaido's body against the strength he exuded, and in that quiet scrutiny, Kaido felt the paradox of terror and protection ripple through him. "I need you to show me." Haru's voice was almost a whisper now, yet every syllable struck with the precision of a scalpel. The order was not one Kaido could refuse, though his instinct begged him to flinch, to curl away, to hide every scar that told the story of nights spent under the weight of someone else's cruelty. Trembling, he reached for the buttons of his shirt, every movement calculated, measured, but inadequate. The pain in his ribs flared sharply, white-hot, and relentless, a cruel reminder of yesterday's confrontation, of the constant threat of being broken further. Haru's hands were there in an instant, catching him before he collapsed, the Alpha's chest solid, immovable, grounding Kaido in a way that was alien yet achingly necessary. The scent, the absolute, undeniable scent, wrapped around him, a blanket of safety in which his instincts could finally unclench, if only slightly. "Breathe," Haru commanded gently, yet the authority in the word made Kaido's Omega instincts hum with an involuntary obedience that was not fear, not exactly, but a recognition of the one person whose control was absolute without cruelty. Kaido exhaled shakily, forcing the air past the splintered ache of his ribs, letting the Alpha's dark eyes catalog every bruise, every mark, every invisible story pressed into his skin by someone who was never meant to care. And as Haru's fingers traced the worst injuries with meticulous gentleness, cataloging the evidence of suffering like a silent vow of retribution, Kaido felt something unfamiliar ignite, a fragile, trembling trust, suspended above terror, suspended above hope, suspended above a world that had never offered either in tandem. "Who did this?" Haru's voice dropped, low and dangerous, yet tempered by a restrained anguish that made Kaido's chest tighten. Names were dangerous, truth was weaponized, yet the way Haru asked, commanded, yet gave space for honesty without judgment, made Kaido whisper the name he had feared to speak, the one who haunted his nightmares and left his body a map of abuse. "Rin," he breathed, the single word trembling into the charged air. Haru's jaw tightened, eyes darkening, the calm Alpha veneer cracking under the weight of a righteous, controlled fury that made Kaido's knees weak in awe and fear. "Never again," Haru said, not as a threat, but as a declaration etched in the very fibers of Kaido's being. "Not tomorrow, not ever, I swear it." The absolute certainty behind the words, the promise, carried a weight that made the bruises on Kaido's ribs ache differently. Less a symbol of powerlessness and more a reminder that he was being claimed, protected, that he had finally found someone whose dominion was not a cage, but a shield. Haru stepped back then, giving him space to breathe. And yet the protective aura remained, a force field of scent, of presence, of intent that made Kaido realize with a strange, terrifying clarity that his life would never be the same. And as the Alpha's gaze softened, tracking his every shiver, every faltering breath, Kaido allowed himself a single thought, a dangerous, dizzying thought, that perhaps finally there could be a life where fear did not dictate every heartbeat. The night deepened over the city, spilling shadows into the penthouse as Kaido sat on the edge of the oversized bed, legs pulled close to his chest. Trembling in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Haru had both ignited and contained. The bruises along his sides throbbed with every shallow breath, a muted rhythm that matched the rapid hammering of his heart, but it wasn't pain alone that twisted his stomach into knots. It was the closeness, the undeniable presence of Haru lingering in the doorway, watching him like a wolf studying its prey, and yet there was no hunger in his gaze, only something far more disarming: intent. Kaido's mind raced with conflicting impulses. The ingrained instinct to shrink, to hide, to disappear was screaming against a curious, terrifying pull toward the Alpha, whose mere proximity seemed to rearrange the air itself, making it heavier, more charged, and impossibly intimate. Haru stepped forward, slow, deliberate, the soft click of polished shoes against marble a soundtrack that made Kaido's nerves snap with anticipation and anxiety alike. "You don't have to be afraid," the Alpha said, voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor, through the bed, through Kaido's very bones. But fear was lodged in his chest like a stone, a stubborn knot that refused to untangle despite the soft reassurance, the gentle cadence of words that were supposed to soothe. Kaido swallowed, forcing air past the lump in his throat, and realized with a start that he was waiting for something he had never allowed himself to want. Validation, protection, acknowledgement, and perhaps, most dangerous of all, desire. Haru crouched slightly, bringing his dark eyes level with Kaido's, and in that instant the world seemed to shrink, the cityscape beyond the windows fading into irrelevance as if the air had been sucked from the room and only the two of them existed, suspended in a fragile equilibrium of tension and unspoken longing. "Show me," Haru whispered, and Kaido's body responded before his mind could intervene, every muscle taut, every nerve alive with the shock of being seen so completely, of having the truth of his suffering acknowledged without judgment, without the casual cruelty that had once been the only response he knew. His hands, trembling violently, reached for the Alpha's, hesitant, searching, as if the mere act of contact could shatter him entirely or, paradoxically, save him. And Haru's grip closed around his fingers, strong yet gentle, a perfect counterbalance to the chaos churning within Kaido. The scent of the Alpha enveloped him, a complex layering of musk, faint cologne, and something inherently predatory that made Kaido's pulse spike and his instincts flutter in a way he had long thought impossible. It wasn't just fear. It was the raw, intoxicating tension of dominance that didn't threaten to destroy him, but to anchor him, to claim him in a way that felt like a lifeline. "Tell me what you want," Haru murmured, and Kaido's throat tightened. The question so simple yet loaded with implications that his mind raced, heart pounding against the cage of his ribs, both terrified and exhilarated by the honesty it demanded. He wanted to flee, to hide, to erase every mark on his body and every thought in his mind. But beneath that fear was something else, something he barely dared to acknowledge. The yearning to be seen, to be held accountable for his own fragility, to be claimed not with cruelty but with purpose. I want." Kaido started, voice cracking, faltering, a tremor betraying his shame and uncertainty, and Haru leaned closer, his presence overwhelming, the heat of his body a tangible weight that pressed Kaido into the mattress. The Alpha's hand cupped Kaido's jaw, tilting it upward so that their eyes met fully, and in that gaze there was a dangerous clarity, a promise of control entwined with care, a recognition of every scar, every fear, every instinct that Kaido had spent years hiding from the world. "Say it," Haru's voice was firm, insistent, yet threaded with a patience that made Kaido shiver, the sound wrapping around him like a rope, binding him not in restraint, but in an almost unbearable intimacy. Words lodged in his throat, choked by a cocktail of anxiety and desire, until finally, trembling, he whispered, "I want to be yours." The admission hung in the air, electric, charged, fragile as glass, and Haru's response was a slow, deliberate smile that didn't mock, didn't coerce, but radiated the quiet, undeniable dominance that had captivated Kaido from the moment he first walked into the Alpha's orbit. "Then you will be," Haru said, the words a command and a promise intertwined. And in that instant, Kaido felt the last vestiges of his defenses crumble, replaced by a raw, dizzying surrender that made every nerve in his body sing and ache simultaneously. Haru drew closer, closing the distance until Kaido could feel the heat of his chest, the steady strength of his arms, the subtle but potent scent that made every rational thought dissolve into instinct. And for the first time in a lifetime, Kaido allowed himself to tremble not from fear, but from anticipation, from a burgeoning, terrifying hope that perhaps being claimed didn't mean being destroyed, but being understood, protected, and desired in ways he had never dared imagine. And as the Alpha's hands traced the lines of his body with meticulous attention, cataloging the bruises, the marks, the evidence of a life hard-lived, Kaido realized with a dangerous, breathtaking clarity that this was more than surrender. It was the first step into a world where desire and safety could coexist, where pain and pleasure could intermingle without betrayal, and where the storm inside him might finally find an anchor strong enough to hold it. The hours slipped by in a haze of quiet intensity, the city lights beyond the windows painting fleeting patterns across Kaido's skin as Haru remained close, an unyielding presence that both consumed and protected him, a paradox he couldn't untangle even if he wanted to. The Alpha's hands moved with deliberate patience, tracing paths over bruised ribs and tense shoulders, each touch igniting sparks that danced dangerously along Kaido's nerves, teasing out reactions he barely understood, his body responding instinctively to a dominance so firm yet precise it left no room for uncertainty, only an urgent, aching awareness of every inch of space Haru occupied. Kaido's mind spun, a turbulent storm of shame, desire, and reluctant trust, as he realized how acutely aware Haru was of every flinch, every gulp, every pulse that betrayed the raw vulnerability beneath his outward composure. "You don't have to hide from me," Haru murmured again, voice low and deliberate, but this time it carried a weight that made Kaido's chest tighten, an assertion that was at once comforting and terrifying, for it promised possession without cruelty, attention without mockery, a claim made in deliberate, unyielding waves. The Alpha shifted slightly, leaning over him, the warmth of his body pressing Kaido into the mattress in a way that was both gentle and commanding, a contradiction that made his heart stutter and his breath hitch as he struggled to reconcile instinct with desire. Each touch was an interrogation and a confession, a language Kaido didn't fully understand but could not resist. Fingertips brushing along the jawline, over collarbones, hands lingering on places that throbbed with hidden pain, as if mapping the territory of both scars and secrets, drawing them out into the light. "Do you understand what you're feeling?" Haru asked, the question rhetorical for he already knew, yet the act of asking forced Kaido to confront the truth he had buried beneath layers of caution and self-protection. Trembling, Kaido shook his head, the admission raw, unfiltered, almost painful in its honesty, and Haru's response was a soft chuckle that vibrated in his chest, not mocking, but acknowledging the fragile surrender Kaido offered, a delicate trust that the Alpha had already claimed. Haru's lips brushed a whisper against Kaido's temple, then along the sensitive skin behind his ear, and Kaido gasped. A sound mingled with surprise, anticipation, and a mounting, almost unbearable yearning that surged through him like a storm wave, threatening to pull him under if he didn't anchor himself to something solid, and that something was Haru. The Alpha's hands moved with precision, exploring the tense lines of his back, coaxing muscles to relax while simultaneously igniting sensations that made Kaido's body betray him with every tiny shiver, every involuntary arch, and every breathless whimper that escaped despite his attempts at control. "You're not broken," Haru murmured, voice steady, yet threaded with a dark intensity that left no room for denial. "You're mine. And I'll take care of you. Every piece, every fragment you think you've lost, I'll claim it, I'll hold it, I'll make it mine." The words wrapped around Kaido like a binding force, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, because to be claimed in that way meant exposing every fear, every past scar, every insecurities he had spent years hiding. Yet beneath the fear was a pulse of exhilaration, a dangerous, addictive craving that tugged at the edges of his mind, daring him to surrender fully, to trust the Alpha with the parts of himself he had always locked away. Haru's presence dominated the room, commanding yet protective, his control unrelenting but never cruel, and Kaido found himself floating in a strange liminal space between terror and release, his body responding instinctively to each touch, each whisper, each deliberate movement that left him shivering with need and wonder. Every breath Haru drew was a reminder of the unspoken bond forming between them. A subtle claim, a silent promise that this was only the beginning, that his world, once cold and isolating, was now being infiltrated by something fierce, consuming, and intoxicatingly real. Kaido's hands trembled as they sought contact, brushing against the Alpha's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the tailored shirt, a rhythmic assurance that grounded him even as desire clawed at his insides. The tension between them coiled tighter, an intricate dance of dominance and vulnerability, anticipation and confession, until Kaito felt himself teetering on the edge of something irrevocable, something that demanded surrender, demanded trust, demanded recognition of the raw, undeniable bond threading through the charged air between them. Haru. Kaito's voice wavered, a fragile plea and acknowledgement in one breath, and the Alpha's response was a soft, predatory smile that carried promise, intent, and inevitability. "I know," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Kaito's damp forehead, "and I'll never let you fall alone." And in that moment, suspended between fear and desire, surrender and awakening, Kaito realized that being claimed wasn't annihilation. It was awakening. A dangerous, breathtaking revelation that his life, his body, and his heart were being rewritten with every deliberate, intoxicating touch, every whispered command, every tethering glance that bound them together in a web of desire, trust, and inexorable need that neither could escape. The night deepened, but time seemed irrelevant, a mere construct that had no power over the space Haru and Kaito now inhabited, a realm defined only by the tension that coiled tight around them, by the way Haru's presence filled every corner of Kaito's awareness, every nerve ending on fire with anticipation and trepidation alike. Haru's hands, impossibly confident and precise, traced invisible patterns along Kaito's sides, each caress a question, a demand, a gentle provocation that left Kaito shivering under the weight of expectation he could not name, could not resist, yet dared not fully embrace. His skin felt hypersensitive, every nerve screaming with awareness, every shiver a confession he hadn't yet voiced. And Haru seemed to sense it all, his sharp gaze dark and knowing, his fingers lingering just long enough to make Kaito ache for more, for something unnamed and dangerous. "You're trembling," Haru observed, voice low, deliberate, and in that single statement, Kaito felt stripped bare, exposed not just physically, but in a way that clawed at the raw edges of his mind, forcing him to confront the flood of emotions he had worked so hard to suppress. Fear, desire, shame, longing, and an unfamiliar surge of trust that frightened him as much as it enthralled him. Kaito swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing heart, but Haru leaned closer, lips brushing the sensitive skin at his collarbone, and the heat of that contact ignited a storm of sensations that left him gasping, helpless, and achingly aware of the pull between them. A magnetic force that seemed to bypass thought entirely and speak directly to the core of him. The Alpha's hands moved with relentless, careful purpose, exploring, mapping, claiming, not with cruelty, but with an intensity that made Kaito's chest tighten and pulse with a mixture of panic and undeniable yearning, a tension that made the world outside the room fade into irrelevance, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a charged intimacy neither had expected but both were irrevocably drawn to. "Tell me what you feel," Haru murmured, his voice a tether, a lifeline, a subtle command wrapped in warmth, and Kaito struggled, lips parting, words trapped in a throat suddenly too tight with emotion. The desire to confess, to yield, to admit weakness and craving, clawing at him with a force he couldn't deny. Every breath, every subtle motion of Haru's body against his, was a lesson and a temptation, a dangerous equilibrium that made Kaito ache in places he didn't know could ache, both from physical proximity and the emotional vulnerability of surrendering to someone so overwhelmingly dominant, yet tenderly attentive, that he feared he might dissolve under the intensity. Haru's fingers found the curve of Kaito's hip, the slight shiver of resistance immediately answered by a tightening of the Alpha's grip, not punishing, but anchoring, guiding, a silent assurance that while Kaito's body might betray him, it was safe in this storm of touch and unspoken desire. Kaito's mind spun, a dizzying mixture of shame, wonder, and an unnameable need as he felt the subtle, deliberate heat radiating from Haru, the undeniable strength beneath the smooth control, and the way every deliberate gesture seemed to read his body with intimate knowledge, unraveling defenses Kaito hadn't known he'd constructed. "You don't have to hide from me," Haru whispered again, his lips grazing Kaito's earlobe, a touch that sent a shiver down his spine, and the words struck deep. Not just a reassurance, but a promise, a binding, an unspoken claim that made Kaido's knees weaken and heart pound with an intensity that left him almost breathless. The vulnerability of the moment pressed in from all sides, but it was intoxicating, addictive, as if surrendering was less about defeat and more about awakening to a sensation, a connection, a claim so consuming it demanded everything he had, every secret, every fear, every hidden desire. Kaido's hands almost instinctively sought Haru's chest, pressing against the firm strength there, needing contact, needing affirmation, needing the certainty of the Alpha's presence, while Haru's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering, an anchor, a predator, a protector, a storm all at once, and Kai realized with both fear and exhilaration that he wanted to drown in it, to let himself be completely claimed, not just in body, but in every trembling, unsteady fragment of his mind and heart. Each moment stretched, taut with anticipation, every brush of skin and whispered word threading a dangerous, intimate web, pulling them closer, binding them tighter in a space where fear and desire collided until Kaido's resistance dissolved, leaving only a raw, aching awareness of need and surrender, and a growing certainty that nothing, no hesitation, no past, no shame, could undo the gravity that Haru exerted over him, a gravity that demanded he yield, demanded he trust. And demanded he recognize the irrevocable truth, that the Alpha before him was not just dominant, not just commanding, but the force that could and would consume and protect every part of him if he allowed it. The room seemed to contract around them, the air thick with a heat that was almost tactile, each breath shared between them carrying a weight that pressed into Kaido's chest and made his pulse hammer erratically against his ribs. Haru moved with deliberate slowness, each motion a careful calculation designed to unravel Kaido completely, to strip away not just his defenses but the very walls he had built around his heart, and Kaido felt it, felt the impossible pull of the Alpha's presence like a force both terrifying and irresistible, a gravity that made him ache in ways he hadn't known possible, both for touch and for the unspoken acknowledgement that this closeness, this intensity, was not merely physical, but a claim on something far deeper, something intimate and dangerous, a binding of spirits rather than bodies alone. Haru's hands roamed with a precision that left no inch of Kaido untouched, tracing lines that seemed to map not just the surface of his skin, but the curves of his fear, the contours of his longing, the hidden territories of his desire, each movement a silent question that demanded an answer Kaido didn't yet have the courage to voice. And yet the answer was written in the tremor that ran through his limbs, in the hitch of his breath, in the subtle arching of his back toward a touch he simultaneously feared and craved. "You feel everything so intensely," Haru murmured, lips brushing against Kaido's temple, a whisper that felt like both an accusation and a confession, and the words ignited a storm inside Kaido, a mixture of shame and relief so potent that he could only let out a shuddering exhale, letting his eyes close as the world narrowed to the sensation of Haru's proximity, the heat of his skin, the undeniable authority of a presence that dominated every fiber of Kaido's being. The Alpha's gaze was a tether, a challenge, a lure, and Kaido found himself leaning into it, even as the instinct to pull back flared sharply against the need to stay, to surrender, to let the overwhelming weight of Haru's dominance wash over him and strip away every pretense, every carefully maintained layer of composure he had clung to for so long. Haru's fingers found the sensitive line along Kaido's jaw, tilting his face just so, forcing eye contact that was equal parts gentle and predatory. And in that locked gaze, Kaido recognized the unspoken promise, a claim that was patient yet inevitable, that respected nothing but the raw truth of what had already begun between them, a force that was at once protective and consuming, tender and commanding, leaving Kaido caught in the impossibly delicate balance of fear and exhilaration. Every subtle brush of touch against skin sent sparks racing along nerves he didn't realize were exposed. Every whispered word against his ear caused him to tremble with an unnameable mixture of longing and panic. And the intimacy of it all was almost unbearable, a tension so thick it seemed to hum in the very air, vibrating in rhythm with his own erratic heartbeat, pulling him further and further into a surrender he hadn't thought he could allow, but that now felt inevitable. Haru's hands, insistent yet careful, traveled lower, brushing against places that made Kaido's stomach twist with heat and confusion, a delicious ache of vulnerability and desire that both terrified and thrilled him, leaving him simultaneously on edge and entirely consumed, every instinct telling him to resist while every instinct also screamed to lean closer, to offer himself completely to the one person who had already claimed him without force. simply through the unbearable intensity of presence, through the quiet but absolute certainty of a dominance that knew no cruelty, only precise, consuming attention. The closeness was overwhelming, and Kaito could feel it. The way Haru's body mirrored his, the subtle shifts of weight, the way the Alpha's gaze never wavered, dissecting and claiming and holding, all at once a promise and a warning that he could not ignore. And in that charged moment, Kaito's breath caught, chest tightening as the enormity of what he felt collided with the undeniable truth that he wanted this, wanted Haru's touch. His command, his attention, wanted to let the walls crumble entirely, to be claimed in mind, body, and heart. Words failed him, but the tremble in his hands, the shiver that ran from nape to toe, the involuntary arch of his body all spoke the truth his lips could not yet form. That he was ready, that he wanted to surrender, that the pull of Haru's dominance was not something he could resist even if he tried, and that the storm of sensation and emotion swirling between them was not just desire. It was a reckoning, an awakening, a magnetic inevitability that promised neither comfort nor safety, but something far more consuming and real, something Kaito had never dared imagine but now could not deny. That he belonged, in some impossible, terrifying, exquisite way, entirely to the Alpha before him. The moment stretched, taut and electric, as if the air itself had become a living thing, pressing against Kaito from every direction, and Haru's presence was the epicenter of that storm, grounding yet untouchably fierce, a gravitational pull that Kaito could neither resist nor fully comprehend. Every subtle shift of the Alpha's body, every slight tilt of his head, every brush of his fingertips against Kaito's skin sent shivers that raced along nerves Kaito hadn't realized were alive, awakening desires he had long buried beneath careful layers of control, discipline, and fear. And yet here they were, raw and undeniable, screaming for acknowledgement. Haru's gaze was relentless, sharp, consuming, and in it, Kaito saw the reflection of a truth he had always feared, the truth that he was seen, not just superficially, not just for his obedience or his usefulness, but in his entirety. The fears he tried to hide, the shame he tried to bury, the secret hunger that pulsed beneath his skin, all laid bare under the Alpha's piercing scrutiny, and the vulnerability made his pulse spike, a mixture of panic and longing tangling into a delicious, almost painful knot in his chest. Haru leaned closer, the faint brush of his lips along Kaito's ear igniting a trail of fire that danced through his veins, making him ache in ways that were entirely unfamiliar and entirely consuming. And the low, almost inaudible murmur that followed carried a weight far beyond the words themselves, a promise wrapped in dominance, a claim that was patient yet inevitable, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the intensity between them. Kaito's hands, hesitant at first, found their way to Haru's chest, feeling the taut strength beneath the fabric, the steady thrum of a heartbeat that seemed to echo and amplify his own chaotic rhythm. And in that touch, a dialogue passed that needed no words. An admission of need, a surrender of control, a recognition of power and trust that made Kaito's stomach tighten with both fear and longing. The closeness pressed deeper, the heat of bodies mingling with the heat of desire, and Kaito could feel the subtle dominance in every deliberate movement of Haru, the way he dictated space and proximity with an authority that left no room for hesitation, a silent command that Kaito obeyed instinctively, drawn forward by a force he could neither name nor resist. Haru's hands mapped Kaito's body with precision, tracing lines of sensitivity that made him arch involuntarily, whimpers threatening to escape as the Alpha's touch moved from gentle exploration to a controlled, calculated insistence that forced every hidden part of Kaito into awareness, every nerve ending alight, every heartbeat synchronized with the Alpha's in a dangerous, intoxicating rhythm that left him trembling. Words were unnecessary. The tension, the heat, the unspoken exchange of dominance and submission spoke louder than any confession could, and Kaito found himself teetering on the edge of fear and exhilaration, terrified of the intensity but utterly unable to pull away. The magnetic force of Haru's presence rooting him in place, while simultaneously pulling him deeper into an unfamiliar vulnerability that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The air was thick with scent and warmth, with the raw electricity of closeness and desire, and Kaito's mind spun, thoughts fragmented by the power of the sensation. The awareness that every motion, every touch, every flicker of expression from Haru carried intent, a precision that left Kaito exposed in the most intimate, vulnerable way imaginable, yet craving more, needing more, desperate for the claim that was already silently, irrevocably his. Haru's voice cut through the haze, low and commanding yet not cruel, each word an anchor and a spark, a tether to reality and an ignition of the storm within. And Kaido's body responded in kind, every muscle, every nerve, every pulse vibrating with acknowledgement, with surrender, with the unspoken truth that he had already fallen entirely into the orbit of the Alpha, that he was caught in a gravitational pull he no longer wished to resist, and that the boundary between fear, longing, and exhilaration had dissolved entirely, leaving only the raw, consuming connection that bound them both in this moment of exquisite, unavoidable intimacy. Haru's presence was a storm that swallowed Kaido whole, each inhale thick with the scent of dominance and something darker, something intoxicatingly raw, and Kaido's body betrayed him, shivering under touches that were simultaneously gentle and demanding, leaving him suspended between terror and pleasure in a dizzying limbo he could not, and did not want to, escape from. The Alpha's hands moved with a precise, predatory grace, exploring curves and lines, mapping reactions with a surgeon's focus, and every shiver, every hitch of breath, every involuntary arch of Kaido's back became a language, a confession of need that Haru seemed to read as effortlessly as if Kaido's body itself were an open book. And the realization that he had no secrets left made the young man's heart pound with a mix of fear, longing, and shame that melted into an almost unbearable heat. Haru leaned closer, his lips brushing Kaido's neck, his breath hot and uneven, carrying the subtle promise of ownership and a challenge that Kaido couldn't resist. The Alpha's voice, low and deliberate, whispered words that sank into his skin, filling his veins with something that felt like fire and ice all at once. A dominance so complete that Kaido's rational mind wavered, the part of him that wanted control quivering and breaking, and in its place rose a fierce, consuming hunger, a craving to surrender, to let himself dissolve entirely into the force that Haru represented. Every movement of Haru's hands, every tilt of his head, every subtle shift in posture was an unspoken command, and Kaido obeyed instinctively, drawn as if by gravity into the orbit of this Alpha who held him with the terrifying and intoxicating balance of gentleness and authority. And the tension between them became unbearable, a taut thread of electricity that connected every nerve, every pulse, until the room itself seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of heat, desire, and raw, unfiltered emotion. Kaido's breath hitched as Haru's lips ghosted along sensitive skin, igniting sparks that ran through him like lightning, each one demanding a response, a surrender that Kaido felt in every fiber of his being, a need to be claimed, acknowledged, and possessed in ways that words could never fully capture. His hands traced the broad expanse of Haru's chest, feeling the taut muscles under skin that was warm and alive, the steady pulse that mirrored his own frenzied heartbeat. And in that touch, in that shared rhythm, Kaido realized the depth of the pull, the gravity of the Alpha's dominance, the inevitability of the connection that bound them together. The air was thick, oppressive in its intensity, charged with the unspoken promise of more, the quiet electric tension of anticipation that made every nerve ending sing with a delicious, almost unbearable sensitivity, and Kaido's mind spun, a whirl of shame, desire, and exhilaration, unable to separate the threads of emotion, unable to resist the pull of Haru's presence, unable to deny the primal, aching need that had taken root in him, raw and relentless. Haru's eyes held him captive, a gaze so piercing it seemed to strip away pretense, to peel back every carefully constructed layer, leaving Kaido exposed, vulnerable, and achingly alive. And when the Alpha's hands gripped him with both force and tenderness, every muscle in Kaido's body responded, arching and trembling, betraying every suppressed desire and secret longing, until the room was filled with the silent symphony of their intertwined need, a delicate, dangerous dance of dominance and surrender. Control and abandonment, fear and craving that left Kaido trembling and aching for more, entirely consumed by the undeniable, magnetic pull of Haru. The night thickened around them, suffocating and intimate, the shadows in the room twisting with the movements of bodies drawn together by a magnetism that neither Kaido nor Haru could deny. And every brush of skin against skin sent jolts of awareness racing through Kaido, making him hyperconscious of the Alpha's presence, the sharp scent of him, the subtle power in every motion, every exhalation, until it felt as though the air itself had become liquid fire. Pressing against his skin and filling his lungs with heat and tension, Haru's hands were relentless, tracing, claiming, coaxing responses that Kaido could not hide, could not fight, And yet every reaction, every shiver and whimper that escaped his lips, made Haru's grip tighten, a silent assertion of dominance that wrapped around Kaido's throat and heart alike, leaving him suspended between dread and the exquisite torment of wanting more. Kaido's mind reeled, a chaotic storm of shame, longing, and fear, as if every instinct had been rewired to respond solely to Haru's presence. And yet somewhere deep in that confusion, there was a fragile thread of exhilaration, a thrill that came from surrendering, from acknowledging the undeniable truth of his desire and the unyielding pull of the Alpha's dominance. And as Haru leaned closer, his lips hovering just above Kaido's ear, speaking words too low to fully hear but heavy with ownership and promise. Kaido felt the last walls of his self-control crumble, dissolving into a raw, trembling need that had no name but demanded fulfillment. Every brush of Haru's fingers along sensitive skin, every press of his palm against Kaido's back, every deliberate movement was a lesson in control, a statement that Kaido's body was no longer entirely his own. And with each passing second, each whispered command, each stolen bite of air between them, Kaido's resistance eroded, leaving him vulnerable, pliant, aching with the desire to be claimed fully, utterly, without question or hesitation. And yet even in that submission, there was a fierce spark of identity, a secret rebellion in the way his body responded with its own will, a dangerous dance of dominance and surrender where neither could fully predict the next step. Haru's gaze was unrelenting, a piercing claim that burned through Kaido's chest and ignited the embers of a fire he had tried for too long to ignore. And as the Alpha's hands roamed and his lips left a trail of heat along exposed skin, Kaido's breath became ragged, each inhale a plea, each exhale a confession of desire he could no longer contain, his body arching, twisting, trembling in response to forces he could neither name nor resist. The sensation was almost cruel in its intensity, a perfect storm of control and yearning that left his heart hammering, his limbs weak, and his mind a whirl of dizzying, unbearable longing. The tension built, unspoken yet palpable, filling every corner of the room, wrapping around them like a living thing, binding them together in a silent covenant of fire and want, until the moment stretched taut, almost snapping under its own weight, leaving Kaido quivering, exposed, his body a testament to the magnetic pull of Haru's presence, and the quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in the Alpha's stance spoke volumes, each one a command, a promise, a dare. And Kaido knew without a doubt that once this moment broke, there would be no turning back, no reclaiming of innocence or restraint, only the raw, consuming, intoxicating reality of being utterly and irreversibly under Haru's control. A truth that sent shivers racing down his spine and set his heart ablaze with desire, fear, and the sweetest, most dangerous surrender. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air so thick with heat and unspoken tension that Kaido felt as though each breath could ignite a spark between them. And Haru's presence was an oppressive gravity, pulling at every fiber of his being, leaving him both terrified and trembling with anticipation. Every deliberate movement of the Alpha, every brush of fingers along his jaw, the firm press of a palm against his shoulder, the way his eyes darkened with a possessive fire, made Kaido acutely aware of the thin line between pleasure and pain, dominance and surrender, a line that Haru crossed with a casual cruelty that left Kaido breathless and aching. His body was no longer entirely his own, responding instinctively to the Alpha's touch, quivering under the weight of desire and the unspoken claim that Haru had laid upon him, a mark invisible but indelible, etched into Kaido's skin and soul alike. Every whispered word, every low murmur of possession pressed against his ear sent shivers cascading down his spine, making his muscles coil and release in rhythms he did not understand but could not resist. And even as a flicker of panic flashed through his mind, what he was feeling, what he was giving away, his body betrayed him, betraying his will with a hunger that had been building far too long to ignore. Haru's hands were relentless, mapping every inch of Kaido with the precision of ownership, every touch a question and a command, and the way he leaned closer, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of Kaido's neck, made the younger's knees weaken and his chest ache with a desperate need that he could not name, only feel in the thrum of his pulse and the heat pooling low in his stomach. There was a dangerous intimacy in every motion, a silent declaration of control, and Kaido could feel the weight of it settling deep in his chest, heavy and intoxicating, making his thoughts blur and his senses sharpen all at once. The tension escalated with a cruel elegance, each second stretching as if time itself conspired to prolong the exquisite torment, leaving Kaido suspended in a liminal space between fear and longing, awareness, and instinct. And every flicker of Haru's gaze, every deliberate stroke across sensitive flesh, felt like a tether, binding him to the Alpha in a way that was as inescapable as it was necessary. Even his attempts at restraint, the feeble protests that escaped in quiet murmurs, were only invitations for Haru to deepen his control, to explore the fragile, trembling boundary between submission and pleasure. And Kaido found himself teetering on the edge of something irreversible, every nerve alight, every thought consumed by the singular, overwhelming desire to feel Haru's possession fully, completely, and without hesitation. And in that suspended moment, when Kaido's body and mind were teetering between resistance and surrender, Haru's hand slid down to the small of his back, firm and unyielding, pulling him flush against the Alpha's chest. And Kaido's breath caught violently, his heart hammering in a rhythm that mirrored the unspoken declaration in Haru's dark eyes. It was a claim, a promise, and a dare all at once, leaving Kaido gasping, trembling, and achingly aware of the intoxicating, dangerous truth. That this connection, this fire between them, was no longer a fleeting encounter or a momentary temptation, but a consuming, binding force that would demand everything from him. And perhaps, he realized with a heady mixture of fear and desire that he was already too far gone to resist. Kaido's world had narrowed to the press of Haru's body against his, the warmth and strength of the Alpha's frame seeping into every nerve. And as Haru's hands roamed with deliberate intent, exploring, claiming, teasing, Kaido felt a dizzying mix of fear and need that left him unsteady, trembling on the edge of surrender. Every movement, every deliberate brush of fingers across sensitive skin, seemed calculated to dismantle the fragile control he still clung to. And yet there was a strange, intoxicating safety in the intensity, as if being so thoroughly consumed by someone else's desire meant he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Haru's lips traced along his collarbone, leaving a trail of fire in their wake, and Kaido's hands, though trying to push away, betrayed him, resting against Haru's chest. Gripping the firm muscle beneath like it was the only anchor in a storm that threatened to drown him in sensations too deep, too urgent, too real. The Alpha's voice, low and commanding, whispered against his ear, each word a tether of ownership, a reminder that resistance was not only futile but unnecessary, that giving in was not weakness but a kind of surrender that carried its own sharp, exquisite power. Kaido's mind spun, a whirlwind of racing thoughts and racing pulse, caught between the intoxicating danger of this closeness and the magnetic pull of wanting more, needing more, craving the very thing that scared him most, being claimed completely, utterly by someone as fierce, as uncompromising as Haru, whose gaze seemed to see right through him, unraveling him thread by thread until nothing was left but raw desire and a fragile, trembling trust. Each touch, each brush of fingers, sent shivers cascading down Kaido's spine, igniting a heat in his chest and lower that was almost unbearable. And when Haru's hand slid over his waist, strong and possessive, Kaido's body responded instinctively, arching, pressing into the Alpha in a language he couldn't name, couldn't control, only feel in the hollow ache of longing and the desperate pulse of need that radiated through him. It was terrifying, intoxicating, and utterly consuming. Haru's lips found Kaido's neck again, and this time he didn't tease, he claimed, sinking in with a possessive pressure that stole Kaido's breath, leaving him trembling and weak, entirely surrendered in body and mind, while Haru's hands, firm and unrelenting, roamed like cartographers charting a map only he was allowed to read, each stroke a declaration of possession, each touch a reminder of the intoxicating danger that came with being so exposed, so vulnerable. Kaido's protests had faded into breathless murmurs, indistinguishable from moans, his fingers clutching at Haru's shoulders as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this: the heat, the tension, the undeniable, thrilling power Haru wielded over him. And in the back of his mind, somewhere between terror and desire, a small, defiant part of Kaido realized he didn't want to escape, that the fire consuming him was one he wanted to feel fully, entirely, and with no thought of the consequences, because in Haru's arms, with his gaze locking onto Kaido's trembling, every fragile, desperate pulse of his, he had found a storm he could not resist, and deep down, a place he didn't ever want to leave. The room seemed to shrink around them, each breath, each heartbeat amplified in the charged air between Kaido and Haru, as if the walls themselves were holding their own collective breath, waiting to witness the slow, inevitable collapse of Kaido's resistance. Haru's hands moved with a precision that was equal parts gentle and commanding, tracing lines along Kaido's body that sent sparks of awareness through every nerve, making him acutely conscious of the ache coiling low in his stomach and the fire flickering along his spine. A fire that had begun as curiosity and fear, and was now a roaring blaze that demanded attention, submission, and reckoning. Kaido's mind spun with a storm of conflicting impulses: fear, longing, shame, exhilaration. But each thought was drowned out by the insistent rhythm of Haru's pulse beneath his palm, the low hum of the Alpha's voice murmuring words of claim and assurance, a dangerous lullaby that teased at the edges of his will, chipping away at the barriers he had so carefully constructed around his vulnerability. His body, once rigid with apprehension, now responded in kind, leaning into the contact, aching for the heat and strength that only Haru could provide, betraying every cautious thought with movements that were both desperate and yielding. Haru's gaze never wavered, dark, focused, filled with an intensity that made Kaido feel simultaneously hunted and protected. And when the Alpha pressed closer, bridging the space between them until there was no room left for hesitation, Kaido's breath hitched, caught between protest and surrender, and his hands, trembling but obedient, found themselves threading through Haru's hair, holding, clinging, as though the contact alone could anchor him in a world that had shifted too quickly into raw, unrelenting desire. Every brush of lips, every teasing graze of skin against skin, was a lesson in losing control, in learning to embrace the chaos that Haru brought with him like a tide that could not be stopped. And Kaido, despite every instinct screaming caution, felt a strange, heady liberation in it. The freedom to be entirely, terrifyingly, vulnerably himself, stripped of pretense, stripped of armor, caught in the storm of sensation and emotion that had become their shared language. The Alpha's hands moved lower, deliberate, claiming, and Kaido's body shuddered, answering in ways he hadn't thought possible, his mind blank, his pulse frantic, every nerve ending ignited with a mix of pain and pleasure, fear and longing as Haru's voice, a low, unwavering current of ownership, spoke against his ear, binding him with words and touches alike, a reminder that surrender was not weakness, but a power of its own, sharp, intoxicating, and utterly consuming. And in that moment, Kaido knew, with a certainty that was as thrilling as it was frightening, that he was entirely, irreversibly Haru. The night outside the city stretched endlessly, a dark velvet backdrop for the storm that had taken residence in Kaido's chest, each heartbeat echoing the dangerous cadence of Haru's presence as they sat close. Yet with a charged distance that neither dared to break entirely, every shared glance a conversation heavier than any words could carry. Kaido's fingers twitched, uncertain whether to retreat or reach, his mind a tangled mess of desire and fear, shame and hope, yet each instinct seemed to lead him back toward Haru, whose calm, unwavering aura had become both anchor and weapon, a presence that demanded submission but offered sanctuary in equal measure. Haru's eyes never left him, the dark depths reading every flinch, every hesitation, every small betrayal of body language that spoke louder than Kaido's careful attempts at composure. And when the Alpha finally leaned forward, closing the last inch of space with a deliberate slowness, Kaido's breath caught, a sharp, desperate inhale that betrayed the tremor running through his limbs. Haru's hand rose, brushing along Kaido's jawline, gentle yet absolute, tilting his face up until their gazes locked. And in that shared intensity, Kaido felt his defenses crumble further, realizing that he had been resisting not the contact, but the inevitability of being seen, truly seen, in a way that left no room for lies, pretenses, or hiding. Each touch of Haru's fingers was a question and a command, a test of trust and surrender that Kaido could not refuse without denying himself the warmth and security that had become an unfamiliar but deeply desired constant in his life. And when Haru's lips finally grazed his own, light and teasing at first, then firmer, more insistent, Kaido's world narrowed to the sensation, the heat, the unspoken promise contained in that kiss, a promise of protection, of claim, of something deeper than ownership. An insistence that he was not alone, not for the first time in years, and as his body pressed forward instinctively, a shiver of fear and exhilaration coiling through him, he understood the full weight of Haru's unrelenting presence. This was both a challenge and a sanctuary, a fire he could not escape, and yet had begun to crave with a ferocity that terrified him even as it thrilled him. And in the quiet that followed, broken only by ragged breaths and the unsteady beat of their hearts, Kaido surrendered a little more to the Alpha, whose power was both dangerous and comforting, whose control was absolute yet tempered with a tenderness that left him dizzy, unbalanced, yet yearning for more. Knowing that each moment in Haru's orbit pulled him closer to a truth he had avoided for too long, that to belong to someone so powerful was not merely about submission, but about trust, intimacy, and the courage to face the storm together, come what may. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Haru's private suite, sharp and gold against the dark wood and soft leather where Kaito had spent the night wrapped in a haze of warmth, lingering touches, and the residual scent of the Alpha who had claimed him in every possible way. And yet even in the safety of that intimacy, the remnants of fear still clung to Kaito like a second skin, a reminder that his past was not gone, only paused, waiting for the smallest misstep to resurface. He moved slowly, muscles stiff, ribs still aching from the last encounter that had left him bruised but alive. And as he wrapped the silk robe tighter around his shoulders, he could feel the residual heat of Haru's presence lingering in the room, a magnetic pull that made every breath heavier, every heartbeat more insistent. And when Haru entered, dressed impeccably yet casual, the Alpha's gaze cut through the quiet like sunlight through glass, examining, measuring, calculating. And Kaito felt naked under the intensity, not from the lack of clothing, but from the exposure of his soul, the way Haru could see the tremor of his hands, the hesitation in his step, the subtle tension that betrayed the Omega's every fear and hope alike. "Did you sleep?" Haru's voice was deceptively calm, but the undertone was sharp, precise, demanding a truth that Kaito didn't even know he had yet to admit to himself, and he nodded, voice small, "Yes." Enough, knowing it was only enough because Haru had not left, because he had remained steadfast and unwavering, a constant presence that had begun to dismantle the walls Kaito had built over years of pain and abuse, a slow, methodical breaking of defenses that was terrifying in its inevitability. Haru stepped closer, and every instinct screamed caution, yet Kaito could not move away, could not ignore the magnetic pull of the Alpha's scent, cedar, smoke, and something darker, deeper, primal, that had begun to embed itself in his own senses, overriding the fear, overriding the hesitation, forcing Kaito to confront the desire he had buried beneath layers of pain and survival instinct. And when Haru's fingers brushed against his cheek, gentle yet commanding, Kaito felt his knees weaken. Not from physical strain, but from the emotional surrender that came from being seen, truly seen, by someone whose presence demanded both submission and trust, whose protection came at the price of revealing every vulnerable fracture inside him. And as their hands met, interlacing with a hesitancy that mirrored his own uncertainty, Kaito realized that for the first time in his life, being claimed did not feel like captivity. It felt like salvation. An intoxicating mixture of danger and sanctuary. And as Haru pressed a kiss to his forehead, lingering, deliberate, the Alpha's warmth radiating through him, Kaito's Omega instincts surrendered fully, not to fear, not to coercion, but to the quiet, undeniable truth that he belonged here, with this man, in this impossible, intoxicating, consuming orbit, and the thought brought with it a clarity he had not known he could feel. He was no longer running, no longer hiding, and every shiver that ran through him was not just from residual pain, but from the exquisite, terrifying, exhilarating understanding that he was exactly where he was meant to be, seen and cherished in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with the dangerous, tender, and unrelenting gravity of Haru's presence. The city lights flickered through the curtains like distant stars as Kaito and Haru sat side by side on the wide leather couch, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had endured and everything that had shifted irreversibly between them. And Kaito felt the weight of months of fear, uncertainty, and longing lift slowly, as if each beat of his heart in Haru's presence erased a piece of the past he had carried alone for so long. Haru's hand found his again, strong, grounding, and Kaito leaned into the touch. The connection a lifeline, a reassurance that he could finally exhale, that he could finally exist without the constant edge of vigilance that had defined him for years. And when Haru's gaze met his, intense and unflinching, there was no predation there, only the quiet, unwavering gravity of someone who saw every flaw and fracture and chose not to retreat, someone who demanded nothing but presence and honesty. And in that gaze, Kaito recognized a mirror of his own need, his own desire to be known, to be held, to be cherished without apology or pretense. The night deepened, folding them into its soft, dark embrace, and Haru leaned closer, voice low and warm, words unneeded but felt in the vibration of his chest against Kaito's, and Kaito's breath hitched not from fear, but from the realization that he had arrived at a place he had never allowed himself to imagine, a place where danger was replaced by devotion, where surrender was not defeat but trust, where being claimed did not erase him but affirmed him. And as the hours passed, shadows shifting across their entwined forms, Kaito finally allowed himself the fullness of the sensation, the thrill, the relief, the desperate joy of having a partner who demanded nothing but his presence and offered everything in return. And in the quiet culmination of their journey, he understood with a clarity that was almost painful in its intensity, that love, in all its feral, consuming, and tender forms, was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced and in Haru's arms. In the heat of their intertwined bodies and hearts, Kaito surrendered fully, not to domination, not to need, but to the undeniable, unshakable truth that he was home, at last, and nothing. No past trauma, no lingering doubt, no shadow of fear could ever unmake the bond they had forged in fire, desire, and mutual understanding. And as dawn crept over the city skyline, painting the room in soft gold, Kaito rested his head against Haru's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of a heart that had become his anchor. And for the first time in years, he felt completely, irreversibly, and joyfully alive.